The events of my past remain etched in my mind like an indelible hard drive. 3 years ago, my blissful marriage of 15 years came to an abrupt end. Following an urgent surgery to remove all of my female organs after giving birth to my second child in 2 years, I discovered that my husband had found a replacement for me. For several years, he had been frequenting a bathhouse every week with a female friend. Despite his social outings, I always trusted him and allowed him to go wherever he pleased, whether it was down south or to a disco. During his visits to the bathhouse, he socialized with 2 female friends, one of whom was a medic who actively helped me with my health issues. Unfortunately, the other friend recently lost her husband, and 2 months later, she and my husband became romantically involved. Though it was clear that both parties were hungry for affection, should they have acted on their desires? The other woman knew my medical history through her friendship with the medic and was aware that my child was only 2 years old. Additionally, she was grieving the loss of her husband, yet none of these factors prevented her from pursuing a relationship with my spouse. My husband's behavior started to change. He began to come home later from his visits to the baths and would call less frequently when he was at work. In bed, he would grumble about not getting enough sex, but I tried to calm him down as best as I could. Eventually, the doctors gave him the go-ahead, but he had already started pursuing other options. After 15 years of marriage, I thought I knew all of my husband's desires, so this sudden change was suspicious. He would come home and talk about his female friends more and more, often mentioning the same woman's name. He also spent more time on his phone, like it was a toy. I decided to investigate and began to observe his actions. As my suspicions grew, I started to distance myself from my husband in bed and even suggested that he find a mistress for his pleasure. This was all part of my plan. Then my husband sent me and our children on a 2-week trip to Egypt, which I suspected was to give him complete freedom. During our separation, I continued to question him about a mistress, but he remained evasive. When I returned, we had a huge fight, and I knew that he was hiding something from me. A week later, after drinking with his friends, he finally confessed. However, I still played the provocateur and forced him to tell me everything in detail. My response surprised him. I allowed him to continue seeing her from 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. to see if he would choose her over me. After he left, I was left to ponder for 3 whole days. With 2 children to care for, including a 2-year-old, I had to consider my options carefully. But when he returned on the 3rd day and began to caress me, I mustered the courage to tell him that we were getting a divorce. The night was long and difficult as we talked, cried, apologized, and made promises. He even threatened to take our youngest child away from me, which left me stunned. I softened my tone, but by 9 a.m. the following morning, he had sent a text message to his lover, informing her that it was over. Although he was back home, I noticed a lot of texting on his phone records. A week later, I printed out the records and confronted him, asserting that no one could deceive me. We had another heated argument, but eventually I gave him another chance. I kept his phone under my control, but one day I received a text message from his mistress while I held the phone. I had to arrange a meeting with her, and I sat in the back seat, hidden from view. While my husband knew I was there, his mistress acted like she owned our car. I couldn't help but enjoy the moment. She refused to speak to me, and I never received an answer to my questions about her conscience or sleeping habits. Deep down, I knew that our problems were far from over. Despite a month passing, my gut remained unsettled for good reason. He had made plans to go to Egypt with some friends. While I wasn't against the idea, one friend after another backed out, leaving only him and his mistress to go. I remained calm, however, as I had guided him in choosing the hotel and made sure there were accommodations for me as well. I had a plan to intervene and put a stop to it. After he chose the hotel, he called several travel agencies. To my surprise, the contract, ticket, and insurance were delivered to our home, all for one person. I found it hard to believe in such a stroke of luck. As I thought about it, I remembered the girl and searched through our itemized calls to find her phone number. Using her number, I found her on social media and searched through her friends until I found his mistress. With his phone in my possession, even if he erased everything, I was able to piece together how he had connected with her through social media and then used the travel agency. Although I couldn't be certain he was flying with her, the delivery service made me extremely suspicious. 10 days before my scheduled flight, I found myself in a dilemma. My husband was preparing to leave for his own trip, buying new things for his journey, which I found quite awkward. Meanwhile, I had made arrangements to leave 2 days after him, with a 5-day reservation in place. I couldn't bring the kids along, as there were only 2 options: either fly them in to join us or leave them with someone else. So I made arrangements with a relative to take care of them while I was away. Those days leading up to our trips were excruciating. I felt torn between leaving my children behind and going to find out what my husband was up to. It was frustrating to think that he might be having a good time while I was struggling with the kids at home. However, if I didn't go, I wouldn't know the truth. What if he was actually with someone else and I was left in the dark? I had to prepare for any possible scenario. If he was indeed with someone else, then I would have to face the truth and decide what to do next. I had a plan in mind. I would return home and have another week to pack up and move to another city where I could start anew. I was ready for the worst-case scenario, but as we sat in the kitchen, just 4 days before our departure, my attention was drawn to my husband's phone as a message pinged on my own device. In a spur-of-the-moment decision, I reached for his phone, but he also reached for it, and a struggle ensued. It was then that I noticed his peculiar reaction, suggesting that something was amiss. He erupted, accusing me of being crazy and shouting, "You're out of your mind." Feeling defeated, I relinquished the phone, and we retreated back to the kitchen. Despite my intuition telling me otherwise, I had no concrete evidence to prove my suspicions. He waved the paperwork in my face, showing me the flight details and 1 ticket number. He stood his ground, and I could not convince him otherwise. In an attempt to calm the situation, I phoned my daughter and asked to speak to her travel agent. Once she departed, my husband continued to berate me, even claiming to have forgotten I was his spouse. On the phone, the agent confirmed that they had originally booked 2 rooms, but later changed to 1. However, she did suggest clarifying the ticketing situation. My husband overheard the conversation and became visibly shocked. It was then that I knew the last piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, and the word divorce escaped my lips. I admitted to monitoring the situation, and I knew he had been seeing someone else. The conversation was a lengthy and complex affair, one that is difficult to articulate and also entirely fictional. By the morning, I found myself sobbing uncontrollably and repeatedly asking the question, "Why is he doing this to me?" It occurred to me that if he had already admitted to having feelings for another woman and couldn't leave her, he could have at least informed me in a calm and honest manner. I wasn't a monster and would have understood his situation. He could have chosen to divorce me without any drama and everything would have been okay. But instead, he attempted to deceive me, forcing me to repeatedly prove that he was indeed having an affair. Despite maintaining a composed exterior, my soul was weeping, unable to reconcile the fact that he had to make a choice, and he had chosen his mistress over me in just 4 months. He and his lover had robbed me of a decade of my life. Eventually, I had gathered all the evidence I needed, and he was oblivious to just how much I knew. Overwhelmed with sadness and self-pity, I covered my face and cried. He then carried me like a little baby to the couch, stroking my head until I drifted off to sleep. When I woke up, someone was gently stroking my face, and I was handed a cup of coffee. He informed me that he had broken things off with his mistress and canceled his trip. When I asked about the money he had spent on her trip, he replied that they wouldn't be getting it back. At that point, I was fully awake and responded with a sarcastic quip, So you paid for her trip too. How wonderful. I phoned the travel agent posing as my wife and inquired about the possibility of changing travelers and whether there were still available plane tickets. The response was affirmative. I then contacted the woman I was with and presented her with two options within a 5-minute window: accept some of the extra money she paid or surrender it to us. I informed her that I would sell my ticket and she would travel with a stranger. This allowed my husband, son, and myself to embark on our Egypt trip, while my daughter remained due to her studies. During the trip, we maintained a happy facade during the day, with extended conversations and extravagant floral arrangements. However, these interactions were limited to when the youngest family member was asleep, and I remained wary, with my trust entirely depleted. Thankfully, the sun aided our relaxation, and the absence of a mistress was a welcome relief. As the time to depart approached, I struggled to decide what to do next. My recollections were marred by betrayal and a lack of trust. I concluded that she needed a partner, having been oblivious during our encounter in the car. Though he had betrayed us both, she was willing to fly away with him. Each time I received a message from her, I trembled in response. Eventually, I decided to persuade my husband to accompany me to the sauna, despite being prohibited from visiting it. He initially resisted, but my persistence prevailed, and he eventually gave in. On Thursday, we went to the bathhouse without a clear plan. My intention was to confront my girlfriend about her betrayal. After my husband and I undressed, I found her sitting with her back to me, unaware of my presence. When she heard my husband's voice, she smiled, and I saw it in her cheekbones. I approached her and suggested we talk, but she refused, claiming there was nothing to discuss. I noticed her asymmetrical haircut and asked if she had shaved yet, which led to her spilling hot tea on me and a physical altercation between us. My husband's companions chased after him, accusing him of causing a disturbance, but I only hit my girlfriend with a few slaps, realizing that I was physically stronger and taller than her. I waited for my husband to exit the men's section, and we left the bathhouse together without any further confrontation. Although I was humiliated by my girlfriend's betrayal and my husband's lack of defense, I was satisfied with my decision to confront her. 3 years have passed since then, and my husband has returned to his usual self. He loves me, and he's a wonderful father. I've come to realize that forgiveness is possible, and I've moved on from the incident at the bathhouse.